All right. Hello, everybody. And this is the second virtual meeting of the Russian Film Club at Columbia University. I'm Mark Lipovetsky, and I'm hosting this event together with Daria Yezerova, the postdoctoral fellow at the Harriman Institute. And today we will be having a discussion about Kantemir Balagov's film Dildo or Beanpole, right? And as you probably know, we due to this pandemic context, we decided that we are not screening films because it's technically difficult, but we discuss those films that are available for screening outside of our setting, and we invite most brilliant minds with whom we discuss the films of our choice. Our previous event was about the project DAO by Lilya Kaganovsky, and now we are talking about the Beanpole. And Dasha, would you please say a few words? As usually, Dasha would introduce the film, and then we'll, or are we doing the other way around?
Yeah, no, we're doing that's the way.
Yeah, okay, I'm just, all right, please, Dasha. And we'll introduce our speakers in a second.
Thank you. Just before I introduce the film, I did want to remind the attendees of this event that even though we do not or cannot screen films, when you register for our subsequent events at the Harriman website, you will always find a link where you can watch a film. We always give the information of where the film can be sourced, right? Now, more about the question at hand, Kantemir Balagov's Beanpole, and I thought I start my very short introduction with just sort of who Balagov is, where did he come from, because he's very much a newcomer on the Russian film scene, but at the same time, kind of a fairly established one already. So he is surely the most talked about directorial debut in contemporary Russian cinema, probably for the past, I want to say, well, at least like 3 or 4 years. And he, as an alumnus of Alexander Sokurov's studio at the State University of Kabardino-Balkaria, that was opened in 2010 and has sort of been slowly gaining the reputation of one of the most cutting edge film schools in Russia. And Balagov is most certainly the most famous graduate of this school, and truly is a kind of been treated as a bit of a boy genius in this respect. He's very young, and his first appearance at the Cannes Film Festival in France was in 2015 when he was only 24 and introduced his first short film. And then he came back 2 years later at 26 with his first film, Closeness, Tesnota, that got the Fipressy Prize, which is pretty outstanding for such a young filmmaker, and for the first film, no less. And 2 years later, in 2019, he returned to Cannes with Beanpole, where he got another Fipressy Prize and Best Director Award at the Un Certain Regard selection at the Cannes Film Festival, and so subsequently has been dubbed as the hope of Russian cinema, renaissance of the Russian film industry, and all of these strong
nice words,
as it were. Yes, but you know, that isn't to say that there is a lot of consensus about his talent, which hopefully today's debate will show. So. You know, there are people who don't agree with this assessment. Just a couple of more things that I want to bring up, kind of in both in that respect and sort of Balagov as a filmmaker. The first point that I want to make, and hopefully we'll discuss it in more detail later on during this meeting, is that whatever the attitude, whatever your attitude to Balagov is, he surely is an example of a kind of a brand new generation of Russian filmmakers whose filmic language is sort of profoundly international. So Balagov claims to be really influenced by Sokurov, and indeed he is, that is his mentor, but he's very much a product of sort of a festival cinema, of art cinema, and just a few names that have been brought up sort of for the chromatic approach to his films has been compared to Abdellatif Kechiche, who he also cites as one of his major influence. Once he started talking about oppression and sort of to tackle more the issues that have something to do with kind of the Russian post-imperial, post-colonial experience, critics compared him to László Nemes, and he's also been, on occasion, compared to filmmakers like Cristi Puiu in Romania, sort of for this dark realism that you can see in his films. So that's one point that I want to make. And the second point that I want to make is sort of more specifically about Beanpole, in that the response was polarized, even though the film was kind of proven to be successful, was shortlisted for the Academy Award. But it is very much kind of a classic example, sort of the curse of the second film, when the expectations are so high that you kind of go into seeing this film with kind of really not prepared for what you're going to see, and more often than not, you end up being disappointed. And among Russian film critics, that's specifically in Russia, that kind of been largely the response, that the film is, while outstanding in some respects, is a somewhat weaker and less convincing work than his first film, despite basically being given kind of a financial carte blanche to sponsor Beanpole. So that's something else to keep in mind. And I'm going to stop with my thoughts on Beanpole at this moment and start introducing our panelists. So our first panelist is Tony Anemone, who is a professor of Russian at the New School in New York City. He is a literary historian and film critic specializing in modern Russian literature and cinema. He was educated at Columbia University and the University of California at Berkeley. Before coming to the New School in 2006, he taught at Colby College and the College of William and Mary. And at the moment, he is working on the first English language monograph devoted to the life and career of the Soviet Georgian filmmaker Mikhail Kalatozov. He's also the editor of Just Assassins, The Culture of Terrorism in Russia, and the co-translator and editor of I Am a Phenomenon Quite Out of the Ordinary, the Notebooks, Diaries, and Letters of Daniil Harms. His essays and reviews on modern Russian culture have appeared in journals such as the Slavic Review, Russian Review, Slavic and Eastern European Journal, Studies in Russian and Soviet Cinema, and he's also on the editorial board of the Slavic and Eastern European Journal, Studies in Russian and Soviet Cinema, and Kinokultura. Mark.
Our next guest is Polina Barskova, and Polina is very well known, I hope, to our audience as a brilliant poet, prose writer, and also a scholar. The siege and Leningrad during war and after the war, which is the background of Balagov's film, is at the center of Polina's interest as the writer and as the scholar, and I think that what makes her presence on this panel very much needed. Polina was born in Leningrad, and to date she published, I think, 12 books, 10 books of poetry, and no, I'm confused. So there are books of poetry, there are books of prose, and there is a scholarly book, and there is an award-winning anthology of the poetry written during siege, written in the dark, 5 poets in the siege of Leningrad, published by Ugly Duckling Press. Polina moved to the United States at the age of 20 and received a PhD in Slavic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. She worked at Hampshire College. Now she's teaching at Amherst and Smith colleges. And may I say this? She is also can be called to begin next fall the professor of her alma mater, University of California, Berkeley. So I probably stop here.
Right, and our third panelist today is Lilya Kaganovsky, who is the Richard and Margaret Romano Professor of Slavic Comparative Literature and Media and Cinema Studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She received her MA in Slavic Languages and Literatures from Columbia University and her PhD in Comparative Literature with an emphasis in Film Studies from UC Berkeley. She is the author of numerous publications on Soviet and post-Soviet literature and film, critical theory, gender studies, women's cinema, and sound studies. Her latest book, The Voice of Technology, Soviet Cinema Transition to Sound, 1928-1935, came out with Indiana University Press in 2018. She is also the author of How the Soviet Man Was Unmade, Cultural Fantasy and Male Subjectivity Under Stalin. And at the University of Illinois, she is also affiliated with the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory, the College of Media, the Department of Gender and Women's Studies, and the Program in Jewish Culture and Society, and the Initiative in Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies. And with everyone properly introduced now, we're first going to give maybe 5 minutes to each presenter to express their views on Beanpole before we launch into any specific questions.
Yeah.
You can start.
Please, in any order. Do we want to go alphabetically? Okay, Tony, then alphabetically you are.
Thanks very much for the kind introductions. So I've seen this movie 3 times now, and interestingly, my reaction has been diametrically opposed all times. First time I saw it, I was completely taken by its power, its emotional power, and its aesthetic power, and I walked away sort of amazed at the talent of the director and the crew, the acting, pretty much the entire movie. I saw it a second time and I had a very, very different reaction. I mean, I felt that at this time that it was so overdone aesthetically that it really hurt the sort of reaction for me. I felt that I was constantly being pulled away from the reality of the situation, and that the aesthetic elements were sort of too intrusive in a sense. They were too powerful, and it sort of upset the balance of my viewing. Very different. So I came away, I went back and I looked at his first movie and found that incredibly different, but very, very interesting. None of the similar problems here, the conflict between the sort of reality and the aesthetic surface. And then recently for this panel, I went back and watched it again, and I don't know, kind of a, Hegelian triad. This time the two kind of came together, the two views came together for me. That is, I felt that the tension between aesthetic surface and sort of historical content or narrative content actually worked together, that they were part of a sort of intentional structure by the director and filmmakers. And so I felt that, and so, coming away from this time, I felt that I had a much deeper sort of appreciation for what was going on, and some of the questions that we're going to be talking about this evening, I think, are directly sort of seem to me very, very relevant, very important. This issue of history and aesthetics or art in the movie. So I feel that while we started talking about this panel, we were thinking about who was going to be pro and who was going to be contra the film. And I feel I've gone sort of, in all possible directions. Maybe that will help me in sort of to defend a kind of positive view of the film at the end. But so I feel that it's a movie which calls up really strong feelings from the viewers for different reasons. And in the way that it is, for me personally, sort of generated diametrically different readings. I mean, I feel that that's a really positive sign about the movie working in some level. That's probably good for me as a general introduction. I'll hand it over to someone.
Thank you, Tony. Polina, would you please express your overall reaction in a few sentences?
I feel somewhat envious to the position just expressed by Anthony, and also to the position, I guess, of the most viewers of this film. And this is connected very strongly for me with the question, who is the intended audience of this film? Because what I don't have, though actually I've been trying to construe this position, but what I don't have is the freedom to work with this film without things that I know only because that's been my field of studies for the last 15 years. But also I want to say that I was at the Petersburg premiere of this film together with many of my friends of radically different ages, ideologies, museum workers in their 70s, leaders of the queer community in their 20s, filmmakers of all the ages and between, but all of them from Petersburg. And it was very curious to observe reactions, and the discussion took hours. As it was mentioned by Dasha, and I guess this is why we're here, my opinion indeed is rather strong. And that is the opinion of disappointment. I'm very curious to know, and I guess it might be one of many topics of our discussion today, about various choices made by Balagov and various sources, ideas, directions that he chose not to use, and various roads that he chose not to take. Before I go into some detail of what I
we'll
would
give
like,
you a chance later.
yeah, right. I also want to say that this direction of work, by which I mean movies about history made in Russia today, but also movies about the siege of Leningrad, seem to be some kind of nerve. And the movie called The Siege Diary just emerged by Zaitsev and began taking all kinds of prizes. And since we can say that the siege is one of the most difficult traumas that seem to produce cultural production today, I think it's exciting that it's one of our topics, and maybe we can continue in our next conversations eventually to ask ourselves and our viewers, why is it the case?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
For now, I'm done.
Thank you.
Then I'll continue.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Polina. Lilya, it's your turn.
So first of all, thanks to everybody for having us and for organizing this. And like Polina, I'm a little bit, I think, envious of Tony for the fact that he could even watch this 3 times. Because I honestly, so this is, I wrote I actually had wanted to see it in Moscow when at its premiere, and I wasn't able to go. And so I watched it on DVD in my own house and as I was writing for the review for Kino Kultura, and I quite literally found it unwatchable. And that's something obviously I kind of tried to theorize as well, and it's helpful. I'm going to plug this book. It's not my book, but it's called Unwatchable. It's a very good book for everybody who wants to sort of know more about it.
I just want to say it's a really good book.
It's a really good book, right? So yes, so shout out to the
very nearby.
But I had to stop the DVD numerous times, either when I hadn't anticipated the turn that the film took, since it was an unusual turn, or when I thought I knew what was coming, and in fact I did. So there you might have actually a way of speaking positively about this, right? Which is that it caught me off guard numerous times, but I did have to sort of stop and walk away from it and then come back. And I found that before, sort of in preparation for this panel, I could not actually make myself watch the movie again. I did rewatch the ending because as I was reading a lot of the reviews of the film, it turned out that my understanding of the ending was quite different from what many people thought, how most people took it. So I was interested to sort of rewatch that and see if I still felt the same. I'll say, so I did not find it as many reviewers did, heartbreakingly empathetic, which I think is a quote from one of the reviews. I was struck even by just the name of the film, right? So in English, Beanpole, it doesn't really evoke much of anything at all. It's unclear even what it stands for. Dilda in Russian, right? That U in the dilda is such a wonderful, ugly sound. As Andrei Bely has taught us, right? It's trivial, it's awful, it's ryba, right? It's all those terrible words that have to do with, Pil, what else have we got? Gliby, right? This is all, I'm just quoting Bailey here, Petersburg. There's something even about the sound of, and obviously that's something that I wrote a lot about, is kind of the sound of the film and the way that that's also unbearable. So that's sort of where I am. On the other hand, when the invitation came out to have me and Tony and Polina speak on the film, I did volunteer to be the positive one. So I did say that I would come out with a pro reading of the film, and I've got some thoughts on that. So I'll do that as we go.
So that's very intriguing.
Excellent.
So you cannot watch it, but you have positive thoughts. So
I'm very intrigued by what the positive thoughts are after this.
So probably when you were not watching, you had good feelings. So that's the reason. So we'll move to the actual discussion, and we'll be talking, I think, about 50 minutes an hour, and then we'll open the floor for questions. But dear invisible audience, we don't see you. Please send the questions while they emerge. Right, you may type them in, and they will be accumulated, and we'll try to answer them at the end of this panel. So you don't have to wait for asking the question before we are done talking. If you are on Zoom, please use Q&A button. If you are on YouTube, just use the YouTube chat, right? Okay, so let's go to the jiggler, right? And let's begin with the first question that already came up in our panelist statements, the question of historicity, historical accuracy, and aestheticism, right? So everybody who wrote about this film noticed its very much elaborate construction of the frame, its play with colors, and some of its takes, especially by the way in the finale, look like really tableau vivant of Renaissance painting, or I would even say Baroque paintings, and this sort of destroyed wallpaper looks as a lavish background, and the constant interplay of green and red is sort of dominating the film. And at the same time, this beautiful, fantastic, at times picture is projected onto Leningrad right after the end of the war, so a little bit more than a year after the end of the siege, and the siege, by the way, is not mentioned even once, right? And we assume that these two protagonists are traumatized by the war. One of them has an obvious PTSD. So can it be still considered an accurate representation of history? Because we understand that history can be represented on different levels, right? There is a level of recognition, there is a level some, I don't know, metaphor, etc., etc. So is there any historicity in this film, or none whatsoever? Right. So, and I would suggest that Polina, who already touched this subject, would begin talking about this, and then all the rest would jump in.
Okay. So, as I've mentioned, I'm trying to move my position towards some kind of Munchian scream or Allen Ginsbergian howl towards some form of question, which I guess would be more productive. My question towards Kazimir and critics who find this work aesthetically enriching is why this team chose not to use at all a huge existing archive of various works, including visual works, dedicated not only to the event of the siege of Leningrad, but also to the event of the aftermath of the siege of Leningrad. This is an interesting choice for me, right? And an interesting approach to the work with history and historical representation. Because actually, when I say that there exists an archive, the archive consists of various points of view by some of the leading artists and photographers of the time. And when I was working recently on the volume dedicated specifically to the aftermath of the siege, it turns out that some very difficult, very sophisticated, very witty masters of the time were trying to figure out this moment, what was happening in the city after its disaster was over, right? For example, people like Kaplan, for example. And for me, it is surprising that the author wouldn't be curious, and the author wouldn't want to be a bridge trying to play with this archive, trying to transfer, mediate this archive, by which I don't mean, I understand that I'm sounding more and more as an angry historian, but I think it would be great, right, to use this knowledge playfully, critically, in variety of ways, to inform this film and also inform the audience about the fact that the disaster of this place, disaster of this moment, was also an aesthetic disaster, that many of its survivors and witnesses and victims fully understood, right? We are talking actually, and now there are historians, there are museum workers, there are artists who are actively working with it. And why the author of the film decided to ignore, for me, this is one of the main points of disappointment. This is something when everybody is writing about the striking combination of red and green, and that supposedly makes this film so striking and touching. My question is, how do we perceive the fact that the streets in this city look like nothing, absolutely like nothing as they looked? Mm-hmm. Why nobody, not one character in this film is really informed by the stories? And by the way, this is something. This is a very interesting topic, which deserves much more study. But some unbelievably interesting queer figures lived at that moment and worked and suffered in Leningrad at that moment. And to be a queer figure in Leningrad, in Soviet Leningrad, during the siege and after the siege, with everything we know from Lydia Ginsburg, was a peculiar situation. But this situation, this position, this emotional position also doesn't have any place in this movie, which for me, for this very reason, that somebody decided just to ignore history, right? Mm-hmm. And again, if it would be some curious conversation and provocation and play with this material, that would be one thing. But just to ignore is a different approach, and it produces a different set of questions, mm-hmm. right? And I guess when I was leaving the room, the huge room in the film theater with the crowd, that thing, the main term, affect, that was kind of whispered, that term of disappointment, total kind of vacuousness of impression, right? That actually it was not about that thing that it claimed it was supposed to be about. So the question is why this film claims this affinity, for what purpose? And I'm afraid that answers are not extremely flattering, actually, right? That the siege and the aftermath of the siege are used for the festival audiences who would be touched by the sound, again, the sound of this словосочетание, combination of words, without really knowing what the thing is about. And this impression, of course, is rather disturbing, I would say. That some kind of speculation, if you wish, is happening. And also, again, this feeling of ignoring history. I understand that comparisons often are crude and misguiding, but for the Western and American audience, I wanted to give an example of, let's say, a movie that would claim to be about the little Polish town of Oswiecim in 1945. And the author of this film wouldn't use any sources in this film and would impose his or her completely contemporary ideas. I can imagine certain disappointment in certain viewers of this film. And this is the primary position that I am to express here. Thank you.
Thank you, Polina. I can call this film, and this film is Oscar winning, which of course is not a good sign. Life is Beautiful by Benigni. It's exactly what we are saying. It is the film that completely ignores the setting where it's supposed to happen. That's what Polina has in mind. So there are multiple maybe so you're right that these models are not so great.
There was also a riff on it in Jojo Rabbit, which was taking it a little bit too far. But Jojo Rabbit was like a comic version of Life is Beautiful in the way it was structured. There's even a scene that it copies. And I actually wonder whether it does a better job with the riff than the original film. But, you know.
But let's get back to Dil. You will forgive me if I will use it. After Lilya's speech, I cannot resist not using this title. But so what Polina said, and continue the conversation. What Polina said, I personally agree with, but I would like to turn the modality. Indeed, let's ask why Balagov is making the historical setting so flat, right? the answer about speculation for me sounds a little bit speculative, right? And it's dangerous if you know how the Russian media and the Russian mainstream react to anything that is related to the war, and especially with the touch of homoeroticism. It is speculative, but on a speculation and minefield. Maybe it would work better for the Western audience, but Western audience knows nothing about the siege of Leningrad, and Polina, you know this better than me, right? So for them, the siege of Leningrad, siege of Sarajevo, siege of I don't know, Constantinople in 1492, it's absolutely the same thing. So the background, just a second, background is as relevant as irrelevant. So indeed, let's ask why, and yeah.
I'm just going to quickly follow up on what Mark said, and then kind of again toss it back to the panelists. I will say that I very strongly agree with Polina about the target audience when Polina said that this is for the festivals. It is a deeply what's people critically call in Russia festivalное кино. It's a well done festivalное кино, but it is it's very obviously that it was the kind of like pitched to Cannes as a kind of a product specifically for that audience. But I also, kind of like to follow up on what Mark said, like, I wonder if there is something to be gained. And I'm not saying that I think that, I just want to kind of position this as a potential angle of the conversation. Is there something to be gained from this extreme aestheticization? If not as far as the realism goes, but in just any aspect whatsoever.
I would try to be very brief now.
Yes.
God forbid for me to sound that I have anything against aestheticization.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I wrote a book about aesthetic takes on the siege. One of the most difficult parts of the whole story of the visual perception of the besieged city is that every diary says the city was impossibly beautiful during and after its disaster. So my complaint, my lamentation is that that was not used.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, please. Who wants to continue? Tony, you already started talking, then turn the sound on.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah. As the only American or American-born of the three panelists, I think that, Polina is right, and the rest of you who are agreeing are right. That is, the film was intended for an international audience. And I think, one can explain that in lots of ways. I mean, in terms of Russian internal dynamics and film distribution and all of those issues, it's, movies will make more of an impact on foreign audiences, international audiences, than if they go straight to DVD or streaming in Russia. I mean, so there's something there going on here, but I think that, there is something going on in this movie and in the visual surface, which is, it's more than just aestheticization, it seems to me. It may not, it's authentic looking. There's a very powerful presence in pretty much in every shot here. Sometimes and there is a beauty which is hard to deny. But that's only really a part of the, what is for me important about the film. And I think of, Polina's other question about the archive of the various archives of photographic materials from the siege. There's another sort of archive of materials about Leningrad in the 40s and during the war, which Balagov obviously knew well, and that is the archive of fictional films about the time. And it seems to me that the movie is, the director made an absolutely purposeful and self-conscious decision to break through the 70 years or so of fictional depictions of Leningrad in the war. And that, to my mind, is clearly a positive element of it. The decision to just film it in color is part of that. The Leningrad is familiar to those people who are familiar with Leningrad and the 1940s. It's a black and white world, and photography, but also cinema. And the director clearly wanted to reject that and to do something totally different. And I think I sort of understand some of the moments in the film which depart from a kind of familiar sense of realism. Any number of critics have pointed out there's very little politics in the film. Some people exaggerate it. There are some Stalinist posters, but they're subtle. They're in the background. They're glimpsed, briefly. But there are a few toasts. There are a few posters that are there. So in a certain sense, one can certainly say that this kind of overarching and totalitarian sort of image of Soviet politics that we're used to is not in this movie. But I think that the threat of denunciations becomes concretely real in this movie. And this, for me, sort of suggests that the movie is, despite the incredibly powerful and attractive surface, the movie is really interested in getting to getting beyond that kind of archival, photographic, black and white image of what Leningrad actually looked like then, towards some kind of deeper truth. Now, maybe the deeper truth seems vapid, but I think the connection between the period and perhaps the contemporary world is clearly where the director is moving. And one of the reasons why that movement seems to me important is, and again, maybe this is, as Polina says, sort of speculatia on the audience. It's a kind of speculative move that people will react better to a historical period, which they don't really know much about, if they're able to connect it to their contemporary existences. So it seems to me that there are any number of things that are going on in this movie of this sort, where surface historical accuracy is replaced by other motivations by the director and the filmmakers. And at least on someone who knows the history and the places, but does look at it as an outsider, I can say that it worked for me.
What are these motivations that replaced the historical film?
Well, I think perhaps maybe the broadest way to think about it is this question of how does one live after victory, a victory which is a disaster and a catastrophe. It's this weird sort of combination, right? But how does one live after that? Mm-hmm. And I think that is a question that, in fact, is very relevant to today's Russia. How does Russia live after the various victories and catastrophes of recent, of the last 20 years? I think that there is a parallel going on there that actually is quite relevant. You can, I can say a little more about it, or, well, let me just say one other thing. There's a sense of the meaning of victory, in the war, right? It does not solve any of the problems for people. They are still faced with the problem of how to construct their lives. And I think that is, the problem of the 1990s, or of the post-1990s, in the sort of developing a kind of post-Soviet culture and a post-Soviet government and a post-Soviet way of life. So I think that there is something going on, clearly there. If you think about contemporary, one clever Russian critic talked a little bit about the holiday of Victory Day in Russia today, how that is the one unambiguously positive holiday that connects the Soviet and the post-Soviet worlds, perhaps. Most of the other Soviet holidays are clearly, no longer taken seriously. And yet, like the victory in this movie, it basically is not helping people, it is not helping the culture to sort of see its way to what you do after the victory. So we're constantly celebrating the victory over and over again for 75 years, and yet life has not moved on. So I think the movie does position itself in terms of this particular issue.
Yeah, and just one word, speaking about the victory, you know that there is this neologism in contemporary Russian lingo, победобесие. So the fixation on the victory in the war that turned into the main point of national religion, and very, I would say, very totalitarian religion that excludes any other falsifications, as they say, of history. Sorry.
I didn't know that word, but it's interesting. The first time I lived in the Soviet Union in 1982-83, that was one of my strongest sort of takeaways, was the bizarre obsession with celebrating holidays of the past, like Victory Day.
I wanted to kind of interject here, both in Balagov's motivation that Mark asked about and Tony responded, and also on the Victory Day. I think when it comes to the latter, it needs to be said that the kind of the mode and the attitude and kind of how the holiday has been presented has hugely changed, not only since the collapse of the Soviet Union, but quite literally in the past 5 years. And I was giving a guest presentation in a class, and I did a little research, and this summer during the pandemic, as you know, the celebration was moved to June, more people showed up at the Mещанский Sud to support Kirill Serebrennikov than went out into the streets to celebrate День Победы. There were limitations due to the pandemic, of course, to celebrating in particular, but it seemed like there was a bigger crowd there. And I think it's quite, or at least like a crowd with more solidarity there. So it seems like the times are changing. And in terms of Balagov, I think I agree with Tony that there is an attempt to kind of rethink representation there. And I think искусство кино, or Сеанс искусства кино, referred to this film as наигранный реализм in a very critical way, right? Because there's kind of an oxymoron in those words. But at the same time, maybe it does display some kind of search for truth, maybe an unsuccessful one or not entirely successful one. But I think, when you watch the film a few times, you can see that there is a lot of intentionality behind the result. So Balagov is not entirely kind of randomly selecting kind of art film staples. Like you can see what goes into making, the color and the cuts and everything else, even kind of the choice of, the red and green, and then you can't quite place why these are the colors, or there are multiple theories, but in the end there is this major flip that is suddenly very striking, that now Iya is in red and Masha is in green, and then they embrace, and then you see kind of the colors blend in, and we might not know or disagree what he's trying to say, but he's definitely kind of trying to find something, let's put it this way. So maybe that's a redeeming quality. Lilya,
let's ask Lilya, right, who couldn't watch it the second time.
Well, I couldn't watch it all the way through. Yeah, I couldn't watch it like, as a movie ought to be watched. Yes, it's so interesting. So I think, so he definitely made a choice to not do it black and white, right? Which I think is the color that absolutely, I agree, we expect, if I think of Blokada films, I think of Blokada, right? I think of Lesnitsa, and I think of sort of, that extreme black and white, very minimalist sound, if you're adding sound at all, right? Kind of palette. And he and his camera woman, Sirida, right? They spent a lot of time. So he came to her already with an idea of the color palette that they would use. They spent time actually pre-shooting everything on film, where they were originally going to shoot it on 16 millimeter. So they kind of pre-shot all of the shots, and then sort of with minimal mise-en-scène and no costuming, but kind of blocking everything and knowing exactly what kind of light they wanted. And then they did a lot of, then they shot it on digital, and then they did a lot of color correction, right? So so by the time, I mean, it's a heavily manipulated film, right? Which is a sort of interesting idea in terms of realism, right? So it's where precisely, if it's like one of the reviewers said, oh, it's social realism, but you're, you know, obviously we're kind of, we don't know what that is given Soviet context, but B, sort of where precisely is the realism in all of this, right?
And where is the society?
And where's the society? It is and then what I also found striking, kind of reading the reviews, is some people talked. So there was a lot about the quality of the light, particularly in the hospital. I forget if it's Seance or somebody else talked about the way that the light streams in. That it's a very kind of that it's a sort of lovely, life-affirming light, and then other people refer to it as, you know, the whole thing is gray, which I thought was really interesting, since it's absolutely not gray. Like gray doesn't even appear as a color. That ochre that's actually fundamental to the film, right? We keep talking red and green, but actually they were thinking of it as green and ochre, and not even ochre, but rust. And I'll again give the Russian here because I think it's valuable. It's rozhavy, right? Which again actually sounds a lot more negative than rust does in English. So it's a kind of rozhavy color. So all of that is I think interesting. What I'm struck by, going off of Polina, is the degree to which it says it's set in Leningrad, but you could have told me any city, right? There's nothing Leningrad about this place at all. It's all interiors. It's, you know, some shots of the street with a tramvai, you know, and then that outdoor whatever, you know, with columns, blue and white space, but like there's nothing Leningrad about it at all, right? So if he didn't give you that note in the beginning to situate you, you really wouldn't actually know where you were, and so that to me is sort of fascinating. Why, if you're going to do Leningrad immediately, you know, after the war, why not show it to us?
Can I throw
something
at this point, Lilya?
Yeah, go ahead.
It reminds me of Balabanov and Brat.
Yeah.
You know, it's another St. Petersburg.
But he wanders around
But
that city. There's a lot of Leningrad in Brat.
Well, there's not the touristy. There's not the part of Leningrad that you would recognize from tourist stuff. There's courtyards and that type of Petersburg. That's what I mean.
No, he even does the river. He does river. There's Petropavlovskaya Krepость. You see, there's a bunch of stuff you see in that one.
There's no real connection between him and those places, I think, in Brat. But yeah, you can see like postcardy visuals there, I think, a couple of times.
I would disagree about Brat too, but continuing on what Lilya said and on what Polina said. So we see an intention here. It is intentional, right? It is not the sort of the era of the imagination, right? And this intentionality in ignoring Leningrad, right? And I agree with Lilya completely. It could be any city, and actually maybe it would be better, and at least Polina wouldn't be as angry if it would be any city. That not only the city is sort of subtracted, but we don't know anything about protagonists, just nothing. We can guess somehow by the body language that Iya is maybe with some intelligentsia background, or maybe, right? And that Masha is more plebeian, but we don't know if what Masha says at this fantastic dinner setting about herself is true, or is she exaggerating. Nothing is said, nothing is even hinted upon, right? It's absolute blank, right? So all the sexuality is reduced to very two-dimensional functions, right? So we know that they are working as at this hospital, right? And that they were on the wall. That's it, at the wall. That's it. Period, right? We can guess that Sasha and his parents are some big shots, but it also looks so fantastic. This 19th century estate with Barzaya, my God, Barzaya, right? and these paintings So we can read it as kitsch, as some kind of just historical illiteracy, right? So complete historical blindness. Or we can read it as
disagree.
Yeah, or we can read it as an authorial intention, which has certain purposes. So probably we need to move on and continue talking about this question, but in different dimensions. Otherwise, we will sort of repeat ourselves, right? So let's move to another angle of this discussion, right?
Second question in hand, and just one word on those damn dogs in that scene, because that kind of threw me off. I was trying to think what it reminds me of, and I mentioned to Mark right before the meeting that the only Barzoi scene I can recall is the adaptation of Anna Karenina with Tatiana Samoilova with when Maya Plisetskaya, the brilliant Tverskaya, is walking those Barzia. Yeah. And that was then when I had to pause the film for the second time. I was like, I can't, this is too much. Moving on with a very different question. Gender in Beanpole, which is probably at the very forefront of this film. And little known fact, Beanpole was nominated for the Queer Palm, which is an independent prize at Cannes, but they really try to keep it under wraps. I didn't know until an hour ago, and apparently it's barely ever mentioned in the reviews, but that is true. It didn't win, but it was nominated. So my question to Lilya and everyone, by all means, jump in afterwards. Can we consider Beanpole as a kind of an attempt, create a vision of history that uses gender as a kind of analytical, critical category to kind of assessing history and assessing trauma, of course? And as a follow-up to what Lilya, you brought up Ksenia Sereda, Balagov's undoubtedly talented cinematographer, and she's even younger than him. I wonder if, to you, sort of her vision of the film, does it ever overpower his? Because it's still very much kind of a male gaze dominated. But are there any slippages there? Yeah. I mean, kind of starting with the second, it's hard to say, because at least in all of the interviews with Sereda, she says that it was completely his vision, and she was just sort of following Balagov's lead. So that, obviously she's a fantastic cameraman, woman, operator. But she insists, I mean, she is, she's not even 30 yet. I think she's still like 26 or something. She was born in 94. It's absurd that anyone is born in 94. Yeah. But yeah, so she insists that that's sort of the role, and this and you hear this actually a lot from Russian, Soviet female cinematographers, which is, it's important to work with a director. It's important not to insist on your own vision. It's important to, this is rhetoric that comes out pretty often. So the degree to which, you can sort of insert a female gaze in there. On the other hand, I would say that obviously the female gaze, despite what I, pretend to argue in my book, I think it can belong to men as well as women, right? It's not biologically attached. So you can so I think that there is, both of Balagov's films focus on women, right? At this, put women front and center. That's interesting and important. We have almost no versions. I don't even know the last time an American film was a story of two women, and it was a story about them. And then at the end kind of, threw away the men and said, you know what, we can do this without them. So I think that there's, certainly passes the Bechdel test. So there's sort of, these are, you wanted positives there. I'm giving you all my positives at once. So female cinematographer, first of all. Second of all, focus on two women and the stories of their lives, right? He's working with Alexievich's material, right, from Wars, that doesn't have a woman's face, whatever the actual English title for that is. Unwomanly face, right? You certainly have a queer relationship
lesbian, homosexual, maybe, yes, absolutely that also, but also just profoundly queer, right? In the sense of kind of out of time, out of step, different, right? You can, sort of all of the kind of Jack Halberstam queer time and temporality is I think really important to this. Right, you have trauma as a break in time, and as a result, you have this moment where you're trying to live after. Tony mentioned the same thing I was going to say, which is how do you live after Победа, right? How do you live after victory? Because really, they're living after death, right? I think what seems, and this is part of I think also what gives the film a kind of horror sensibility, right? Death had already come; it had already arrived. It took everything. There is no future. Whatever you're trying to build on the other side, and particularly I think because the film focuses so much on sort of reproduction and the possibility of actual biological reproduction, and then gives up on it. In my mind, to my mind, gives up on it. I've read reviews where they're like, they're going to have a baby and it's going to look like them, and I'm thinking, really? Did you watch the end of the film? But okay, right. So I think no futurity. I think it actually turns away from all of that. So those are, so I'm not, so yeah. So there, I think that's not quite, that's sort of gender, sexuality and queerness all mixed together. But I think from that angle, the film is super interesting, and super radical, probably particularly for the Russian audience. And probably also then appealing to a kind of festival, European con, etc. audience, right? I don't want to be too dismissive of the whole it's a festival film, because I've also read what are clearly very conservative Russian reviews that's their dismissal of the film as it's just made for the West. So I don't want to quite go fully down that road. Yeah. Is that enough? That might be enough for the moment. And you want me to look at the question about sound, yes?
Later on.
Yeah.
But just as a follow-up to what you said, why is it unwatchable, as you mentioned?
Because this is something that I say in my review, because you take somebody, so we're meant to identify with Iya, right? And we're meant to, all of the close-ups. We start with her. We're inside her. We're literally inside her head when we start, right? The first sounds we hear are the sounds that she's producing, and there's that weird sort of noise, right, that we hear both at the beginning and at the end of the film, where we're clear, like a kind of ringing in the ear that is clearly inside her head. So we're very much in her and with her. And we're just for 7 hours and 17 minutes, we watch her being abused. And what is the pleasure in that precisely? So it is a film about women. It's a film about women's bodies. It's a film about control of women's bodies, but it's also a film that is just insists on victimizing this person over and over again. And somehow we're supposed to find this. What precisely? Empathetic? Pleasurable? Pleasure and unpleasure? Like, where are we?
Why not disturbing? Why being disturbed is not the aesthetic effect?
But that would be very close to the unwatchable, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, but let's go on. Thank you, Lilya. The conversation about gender and probably the conversation about body and gaze. They're all very important. So colleagues, what is your take on these issues?
I'd love to hear Polina, since talking about the reactions of the gay community in Petersburg when you saw the opening. That you mentioned.
Actually, I can turn our audience to the most trustworthy source of knowledge in our days, being Facebook, where, for example, one of the subtlest and strongest contemporary Russian poets, Katya Simonova, wrote a very detailed explanation and kind of manifesto of the contemporary queer creative community about this film being unacceptable, very much from the point of view of what Lilya just mentioned. Basically being a rephrasal of Leo Tolstoy famous complaint about Leonid Andreev, «Меня пугают, а мне не страшно». They are scaring me, but I'm not really scared. But what? I would say rather frustrated and disgusted. And actually, for me, one of the reasons of this effect is connected to historicity again. We know that the siege and its aftermath created all kinds of experiences, all of them body experiences of the ultimate body kind, right? We have 1 million of people who died of hunger, and more than that of people who didn't, who survived, and whose bodies were forever disturbed by this experience. The fact that the author of the film choose not to work with any of this experience, but to impose on us a fantasy, I find this to be unwatchable, that the artist is making me to suffer, to provoke me into empathy that is not fed with my relationship with history. And this is my personal, but as I understood, rather strong conviction, basically, that about ethics of representation and ethics of representation of trauma. Also, I wanted to say something to Mark and to Lilya about this claim that this is a film made for the West, and also for the West that doesn't know the first thing about the siege, for example. It is true. But actually, once I saw very strong argument for the idea that West actually really wants to know. I saw 19 boxes of letters of readers of 900 Days by Salisbury, by Americans. I never saw so much mail to the author in my life, and hundreds of reviews. And so again, I think that in whatever provoking form, and actually George the Rabbit is my absolutely favorite movie, Dasha. So I am happy to go to talk about this direction, but to choose not to inform users of culture outside of the specific locale of the disaster. I cannot share this idea. Now to Tony. There was color of the siege. And actually, for example, I can name you the favorite girl of Filonov, and perhaps the most amazing artist creature of the siege, Tatiana Glebova, left dozens and dozens of the depictions of the siege in the brightest color possible. That again, nobody knows them here, and that very rarely they exhibited there, and that these could be turned into a different siege, un-Soviet siege, the siege of non-Soviet representation. Right? There are so many ways. This is the choice of way by breaking away, by ignoring the culture that was created. And to your question, how Russia now treats its history, it does in the same way as Balagov, curiously, just by ignoring. Or just by ignoring what happened, basically, right? People who celebrate victory, they don't read witnesses' accounts. And this is the paradoxical way where these two directions move in the point of not wanting to know history as it was, not wanting to turn it into new kind of art. And this is what I think is a loss.
Yeah, that's a very strong statement. Thank you, Polina. Tony, you haven't said a word yet.
Yeah, can I reply to that a little bit? Yeah.
Sure.
It's, you know, sort of listening to what people are saying, I'm moving towards seeing the movie as kind of a radical rejection of history for art. Art is not about knowledge the way history is about art. So it seems to me that in a certain sense, the movie is, and I think for me, the strongest part of the movie is to do with the emotional aspects. It's not the color combinations. You know, that's done very well, but that's a kind of formal device that doesn't really strike me as that central, really, to what is the central emotional truth of the movie. And for me, the scenes of the death of Pasha, and especially the long scene with Stjopa and his wife, and in the hospital, the paralyzed Stjopa. I mean, that for me is where the movie presents this incredibly intensified emotional sort of content, which I completely agree with you is going over into a kind of melodrama. But I feel that the thing about the movie that is new and that is powerful is in fact the combination of art house techniques, you know, extremely minimal dialogue, almost no psychological insights except what one can see or how people behave. It's not scripted into the language, the long takes, the long awkward sometimes silences, all of those sort of art house techniques combined with these scenes of almost, I would call them unbearable emotional power. And the sort of underplaying of the actors, the deliberate underplaying of the emotions, I think helps to, in a way which is very different from traditional melodrama, but it increases the emotional power of those scenes. And for me, those scenes are among the most, difficult to watch. So I find that the movie is really not about knowledge. It's not about information. It's definitely not about the things that you might have, been more interested in watching, but as a sort of representation of emotion in individual cases of absolute extremity, and the person paralyzed, in that scene. I mean, I think that it doesn't get any more sort of emotional than that. So for me, the movie is about those moments, and I have no desire to criticize the movie for not doing other things. It seems to me that what it does here is important and it works well.
Thank you. If I may, just a few words, Dasha, if you don't mind. I would support Tony and not argue against Polina's point of view, because I agree what Polina has in mind. So if we treat it as a historical film, it's a failure, certainly. And perhaps you are right, and that's the product of the same tendency that makes the religious celebration out of victory, right? Sort of the ignoring of actual history. But I agree with Tony that it is an attempt to use history just as a background, and background for what? Right? Background for some statement about human beings, right? And what Lilya says also, and that's exactly about gender and about sexuality. And I would say that it is a film about sexuality, but it never slips into pornography or anything else. But at the same time, it is incredibly corporeal. I felt myself when rewatching this film that I really can sort of feel not only the noises in the head of Iya, but also sort of her body is very, very strongly present there, right? Her body language, her clumsiness, her anxiety about her body, this motif with bleeding that seems to be borrowed from Stranger Things. It's in fact is the bloody fluid, and the fact that she is bleeding because of beating, right? In the final scene, it sort of creates some strange connection new level of connection between her and Masha. And basically speaking, I think that what this film showed for me, that I didn't see before anywhere else, is something that may be called the biopolitics of the everyday. So this scene with Stepan asking, basically, and his wife asking to kill him peacefully, and sexuality that turns into some kind of commodity that has to be extracted by blackmail. So it's all about body exchanges, I'm sorry, which constitute certain invisible economics of the everyday, right? How historical it is, I don't know. And Polina, I trust Polina's judgment, probably not at all. But again, here we have this sort of paradoxical, maybe very abstract setting that after the war, in the situation of death, as Lilya put it, right? People most of all want to have children, right? And this entire all couples, they reproduce the relation between child and parent. Although, by the way, I think that the sort of the excuse to heteronormativity is that women here are sort of doomed to be mothers. They feel themselves incomplete without motherhood, which is of course a very, very patriarchal standpoint. But that's my take, and I don't want to push it too hard, of course. Right.
About the corporeality that Mark said, I think the kind of the biopolitical economics, I just realized that the tableau vivants that we mentioned earlier in this conversation, of which most prominently really in the film there are two. There's the one Pashka is standing in front of the soldiers and they're like asking him to like show us the dog, like act like a dog. And then the second one is the Bani scene, and they're shot in the exact same way. They're both profoundly unrealistic. I thought these were probably the most unrealistic scene in the film. And this is the saturation of the body. Even with the man too, obviously in the Bani you have all of these nude women that kind of cramped in not that big of a space, so it kind of intensifies that. But even with men too, that's it's kind of like the tableau vivant of their injuries and kind of the ones that they suffered, the amputated arms and legs, etc., etc. So I think that goes as kind of, this is the signaling the intent that biopolitics in the body will be central to the film. I think that's like when the intentionality really comes out with that respect specifically.
Yes.
And this is going to be in a slightly different direction, but one of the things I kept thinking about is, so there's that moment in Sokurov's Russian arc where they they open the door and they right to this room that is dark, and the wind and the curtain, right, the glass is blown out, the curtain is blown, and it's just frames, they're picture frames without the paintings in them. What I kept thinking was that what Balagov was doing was somehow restoring those paintings, putting them back into the frames. And this is why they're so Flemish, Dutch, Rembrandt, right? You've got all the light, you've got these tableaux vivants, you've got these perfectly staged, very pretty pictures that somehow, and this is sort of, I guess, the question, somehow are supposed to stand in for the trauma, the horror, the aftermath, of the war. They're supposed to fill those frames, and it's so. Anyways, that's just the kind of visual that kept coming back to me as I was thinking about this film.
I would like to return to an interesting, I think, direction of this conversation about how this film works as a melodrama.
And it has no music, by the way, except at the end. So
yeah, there's no melodramatic ending, right?
Is missing.
Yeah. For me, there exists a tradition to this. of which I'm sure none of you would be aware. Unfortunately and fortunately, I was really impressed and surprised to find out that there exists, I would say, a certain number of books about the siege, American books, which are romance. It's a completely unbelievably curious kind of creation. All these women, I think, skipped through Salisbury and read some other American rewrites of Salisbury and came to the conclusion that this would be a great way to create what Tony said, background, history as a background. But
I said that.
Sorry, history. Okay, since this is being recorded, we can check. So, but I would say history as a background in a provincial theater, rather something dusty and rusty. I like the rusty term. So with this rusty background of the siege, the American writers, most of them use women's surnames that I didn't research, write about passions in the city of Leningrad and its aftermath. And the very important and necessary episode of every novel is Anna Akhmatova walking the streets of the city. It's amazing and very exciting that you see Akhmatova in each of these novels, of which I found a number, and one day I will share this knowledge with you wider. The fact that Akhmatova, of course, was not in the city is not a problem for the makers of this film. They are much more concentrated on the passions and totally are not aware that none of the passions that they describe are possible in this historical context. They are not interested in the historical context. They're interested in creating affects and emotions. The problem is that, again, all these emotions are non-authentic. There are certain kinds of phantasms. And this is why this is unwatchable and endlessly amusing for me, but I find this to be a sick kind of amusement, right? And when I teach my courses on representation of the siege today, which include some radical works of the contemporary artists, and when my students, American students, say, but this is a film about queer life, right, about the siege and aftermath, this is so exciting, to which I'm saying, like, to my liking, the best book of the 20th century, being Lydia Ginsburg, The Story About Mercy and Cruelty, is written on the same topic. Please read it. Please read it. And then compare it to the impressions of Balagov.
So Polina is firm in her historicist approach and in her sort of, I would say, feeling sorry that the film is not what it could be, which is a very valid position. But Elena Prokhorova, our dear colleague and friend, hello Elena, asks us all, can we attribute at least part of the problem to the director's youth? And I would like to ask this question even in more sort of large scale way. Maybe it's can we detect in this film elements of what would be the millennials cinema, millennials approach to what for us is historical material and for them maybe, I'm just throwing a wild guess, just a trigger for affect, as Polina put it. So is there anything that would, for instance, connected with the subject of our previous discussion, Dao, although Dao is not made by a millennial, but it definitely suggests a new way of dealing with history by the means of cinema. So Tony, would you please start this conversation?
Sure. Yeah, it's an interesting and complicated question. And I don't feel that I have any particular insight into the millennial generation in Russia these days. You know, on the surface, based on our conversation, one can easily ascribe this movie to the, not just the youth, but the kind of cultural background of the millennial generation, I guess. But it's interesting that, you know, especially when you think about the connection or the comparison with Dow, you have two, I mean, how old is Kaganovsky? I forget.
Kaganovsky, I think
Born in
he's
the early 70s. I want to say he's like,
yeah, okay.
or maybe more than that. I don't know. I think he's from like 1972 or something.
Right. So they're different generations, but he's still a young man. As to my mind, Balagov is representing a kind of combination of contemporary art house cinema language with, as I said, a kind of attempt to channel the emotion of melodrama. I wouldn't suggest that the entire movie is structured as a melodrama at all, but that it's basically using the, you know, the emphatic, intensified emotion of melodrama to create something new. You know, clearly it is based on, this movie can only be made with a not only massive talent, but massive confidence and belief in the techniques of art to make a statement about human emotions and to, you know, Polina talked about emotions that are not authentic. And I would just say that I think that the audience members who are moved by Balagov's depiction, I think that those emotions may be authentic, can be authentic. So I would make a distinction there. But so anyway, but it's interesting when you think about a person of that generation who is so convinced in the power of art to make a movie of this sort, to believe that the powers of art are more important than the powers of sort of historical understanding, some of the things we've talked about. That's an interesting person. And when you compare that to Dow, which is, you know, a radical rejection of everything that art does in the cinema. It rejects scripting, it rejects structure, it rejects lighting, it rejects pretty much, you know, it rejects real characters. It is attempting to somehow skip over art and recreate life for us. There's, you know, even cinema verite looks old-fashioned compared to Dow. And I think that what you see, so paradoxically, the younger generation has a greater interest in art. And the thing about the Dow project that's really interesting and is, you know, as people probably know, his latest project is to turn the Babi Yar Memorial into some kind of, I mean, we call it a theme park. That's, it's basically a kind of park where people will pay admission. They will enter a world. They will take on an identity either of a guard, of a Nazi soldier, a Jew. I mean, it's a kind of crazy, psychotic, it seems to me, you know, deeply misguided project. And yet one can see a kind of connection between that project and Dow, that is the cinema project. And I think that the key is, as I say, a rejection of art, an attempt to bypass art and to find a way to make people feel something, more than feel something, experience something, which is, you know, we talk about experience and it's different ways of experiencing, right? We experience emotions when we watch a cinema, but it is it's a different sort of experience when you compare it to actually living in the Dow building and, you know, and being a participant there. Or if you compare that to what the audience will experience if this Babi Yar park is ever made and people would go to that. So it seems to me that there's a real kind of, you know, a kind of misunderstanding of the way that art works at a distance and through a combination of intellectual and aesthetic and emotional triggers in our brain. Krzyżanowski has sort of abandoned these traditional techniques in some kind of, quixotic or megalomaniacal hope of creating some kind of new reality. So in some sense, Balagov's project is much less ambitious, and I also think less insane. I mean, he's trying to build, I think, a bridge between the past and the present. And in that sense, it's fairly traditional. He is, I think, also convinced that cinema works through metaphor. It doesn't work through a kind of recreation of reality, but it works through metaphor. And I think that much of the problems that many of the points in the film, which are objectionable to people who are interested in the historical reality of it, I think make more sense as metaphors. For example, the scene with Sasha's parents. I totally agree with you. It's the thing about the Borozoi is particularly funny, since the first scene of the movie, they tell us that all the animals have been eaten in the city. So I totally agree that the scene seems to come from another world. And I think that's the point of it, in a sense. Basically, he is giving us a metaphor of the kind of class conflict within the classless Soviet society of the period. Here we see the differences between these people. We see the existence of class in a way which is purely metaphorical. In the entire scene, past the dogs when they're sitting at lunch, all of it is just a metaphor for something having to do with a kind of reality of this world. It's not historical in the sense that we think of it. It's not perhaps the way that party leaders lived. We don't even know what these people, what their jobs were, right? But it does, to a certain extent, work as a metaphor for me. So I think maybe I've said enough. I see lots of people shaking their heads no, so I'd love to hear responses.
Responses to Tony.
Very important moment for me. I really appreciate what you are saying about the methodology of Dao. And I am a huge champion of the Dao project, and how you are discussing what Krzyżanowski was trying to do there. I find it really convincing. I have some piece of good news about the Babi Yar project, where Krzyżanowski is participating. Since his original suggestion about the performative space, what happened there is that a group of historians, international group of historians, raised awareness about the ethical and aesthetical set of problems around it. And Krzyżanowski now is working with them. And I will be happy to share with you all kinds of discussions that are happening now, right? And for me, this is actually a very interesting development of events, that such a wild non-millennial as Ilya would participate in a together project, that such a provocateur and such a creator of affects as Krzyżanowski would invite boring crusaders like me at the same table. And what is happening now in their project, I think, is absolutely fascinating, because it's obvious that artists and historians need each other in this kind of work. And and by the way, he also invited Laznitsa to this conversation. So I think for me, this is the way.
Any other comments? Lilya?
I'm trying to think about the millennial question, and I don't have an answer. Is it because he's so young, the whole team is so young, everyone is so young?
The scriptwriter isn't.
The script
who wrote
Beanpole and the scriptwriter is not an unknown figure. Alexander Terikov, he began his career during Perestroika by very brutal stories about Dedovshchina, about the army. Then in the 2000s, he wrote a very strange historical novel, Kamennny Most, The Stone Bridge, where he was sort of exploring in his own way the so-called Deloval chat, the affair that vindicated children of the highest Kremlin elite in the middle of the war, in the murder story. And that was a strange novel because it was its main mood was that was the great generation. That was a generation of the great Iron Empire, and we are nobody in comparison with them. And when I saw his name on the script of this film, I was mildly shocked, and these pieces don't connect for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, but then also you add in the Alexievich, right? That there's some inspiration from her book as well.
For me, the shocking name in the whole equation, and very curious name actually, is Sokurov.
Sure, as the father figure.
Right. The Kazimir quotes him all the time. Kantemir. Why I think Kantemir, it's even better, much better, obviously. Quotes him all the time in the interviews. And there is some kind of student-teacher dynamics. And of course, one thinks about this episode in the Ruski Kovcheg with the accursed Siniya Boroda room. But if we build on this situation, it seems that the answer to Sokurov's question, so should we enter the forbidden room? Should we try? And Kantemir says, no, we shouldn't. It's black and white, kind of too much research is needed. And why bother?
But they did do research. They researched, I don't know, there for some reason there were Moldovan magazines or things that were involved. There was, they tried to find period clothes and period objects, and they spent a lot of time on the mise-en-scène and what the walls will look like, and that wallpaper and the paint and the doors, and so it's not completely without a desire for authenticity.
I would also add about the Sokurov relationship is, I think, really, really interesting and really central. But it's not only that Balagov is turning away from Sokurov, but in many ways there are some deeper connections, I think, between the two. When you mention, Svetlana Alexievich, the attitude towards that as an original source is extremely light. That is, Alexievich's most Soviet book. It is 90% heroic tales about women, and by the very end, you start getting a little bit of the darker side. It's a book which, it seems to me, adds to the Soviet mythology for the most part, rather than what was happening here, which is really trying to sort of eliminate, to try to get through Soviet mythology in many ways. But Sokurov uses his literary text also in his own ways. He takes some little bit from it and makes a movie out of it. But also, I think Sokurov is someone who also is very interested in creating sort of metaphors for the past. He's not. If you look at moments in Ruski Kovcheg, he's not recreating the past in historically accurate ways always. There's a complicated play between a kind of conventional past and what he's talking about. I think the basic techniques of this film, most of them do come from Sokurov. The way people talk, the way they're silent, the long takes, all of those things. So it's a really interesting, I think people need to, there'll be people writing about it more, but it's a fascinating, complicated relationship between the two.
Esteemed panelists, much as we want to continue, we have to move to questions. And right before we do so, since we popped up the Sokurov question, just brief comment before we do so, and I'm going to use my privilege as a moderator. Yes, Sokurov's mentee for sure, but also he works with Alexander Radnyansky, who is the producer of most of Zvyagintsev. And I don't know what the kind of the creative impact of Radnyansky is, but if there is some, you can also kind of trace the very non-Sokurov elements in it. And B, in defense of millennials, I don't think it's a millennial problem, the Beanpole, because he did make another historical film. Closeness is equally historical, and it doesn't explicitly bring up Chechnya, but you definitely get the message, kind of the historical message, and the kind of the tragedy that was through that like absolute peak in the plot with the watching of the tapes, and Beanpole just doesn't have it. It's much looser in terms of the plot structure. And now we're going to go to questions. Mark, can you see what the questions were?
Yes, and some questions were addressed, and we don't have too much time left. Agrim Nurmakhanova asks probably a more general question. Do you think that Beanpole is setting the trend of Russian directors catering more to the Western audience? Do you? And that's also the generational question. Lilya, what do you think as following the
set more
trends?
to a Western audience? I don't know. I'm really on the fence about that. I think that he's actually probably targeting Russian audiences with a desire to make a movie about the war that is not like all of the other movies about the war. But at the same time, yeah, the appeal is probably more to the West than to the. Yeah, don't know. Don't have an answer.
Good idea.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Tony just said a word that I think is very, very important, and it kind of clicked. Mythology. Actually, I think I can agree, and this is connected to the question of the intentionality of the audience. I agree that Balagov's attempt can be read as desire to break away from certain set of mythologies. But I also, as it was obvious from my previous exclamations, I think it's a misguided attempt of a very interesting and actually very productive idea that mythology is to be undone. We have instruments to do so.
In connection with this Andy Cateville's question, and I will slightly rephrase it, he is asking, what is your, dear panelists, favorite historical film of past 2 years, Russian historical film of past 2 years? I think that past 2 years is too narrow of a frame to make a pick. So just give us.
Russia makes a lot of historical films in the past, in the space of 2 years, because there is the Goszakaz for historical films. There is never a shortage of historical films. I
suggest that they may be from the past 2 years, but they may be from the longer period of time as well. Your favorite historical Russian film? Soviet can count as well. What do you think?
I just wrote a big article for Science of the completely crazy argument. So I'm not against crazy arguments. I wrote that Alexei German's Trudno быть Bogom is the best movie about the siege that we have so far. And that he takes us very far from our expectations and very far from mythologies, and nevertheless makes something very authentic. So it is a difficult conversation. Thank you.
That is a very unusual choice, and I know that movie pretty well, so I'm really looking forward to reading the article, Polina. I was going to say that most Russian historical movies of recent years I hate, and sometimes it's hard to know. I mean, I was going to say though that some of German's movies about the war, for example, are among my favorite movies, and Девять дней без войны, or Ivan Marshall. There are several of them that for me are the best. And obviously there's that was a revolutionary way of looking at Soviet history back then when he made those movies. Today that seems like a million years ago compared to the sort of blockbuster historical movies that are coming out so frequently in Russia.
It's about unwatchable, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah.
Yes, Lilya, please. Sorry.
Well, the movie that I kept thinking about, in part because I think German Jr. is about to make a kind of version of it, is Крылья. And because it in a sense it has that same, it's not the same conceit obviously, but it is, but there's a similarity there, right? You have the life of a woman after the war and whether or not it's possible. Right. Again, it seems to be like a question of survival and dealing with trauma, and the way that trauma is represented in that film, I think, is actually so wonderfully done. I mean, I really think Shipiska's, that I think that film is absolutely amazing. But the way that it sort of takes us, that it breaks the realist mode, right, and suddenly takes us somewhere entirely different, flying through clouds, and then we get her perspective, right, and all of that stuff, I think, is done so remarkably well. And it's a beautiful film, and it's a well shot film, and it's a well composed and written film, and it has lots of silences and lots of things, but it doesn't go over the top, both in terms of color, you know, right? That thing that Beanpole does, which is it just kind of takes us over onto the, you know, if you want trauma, I'm going to give you trauma, right? It's kind of a punch in the nose. So, but I'll be curious to see what German Jr., who I don't love either, does with the topic.
Remakes of great movies are usually a bad idea, aren't they?
Well, I'm not sure he's remaking it, but it's about women pilots in World War II. So, yeah. And it's called something like Vostok or something.
I really like this parallel with Krylia. I think that there is something deep in this parallelism. Here are two questions from Ivan Sokolov, mainly addressed to Polina, and I, of course, will pass them to you, but others may jump in. So the question about Alexievich, I think we answered the question that Ivan is asking. He writes, to my knowledge, the director and the press alike pitched the film as based on Alexievich's Увоенное женское лицо. Not enough or wrong source. Not enough is an exaggeration. There is only the choice of women who were at the front lines that connects with Alexievich. All the rest is just, and sometimes there is a feeling that the only book that the director has read about this time period and about his characters.
Well, it's more inspired by than based on, if we're getting into the nitty-gritty of the terminology.
Exactly.
It's not to be thought of as based on that.
Yeah, so we cannot find any plot lines that are directly picked from that book. But here's another question, the most interesting question. Could you elaborate on why and which affects and emotions of the characters are anachronistic? Could you please elaborate, if you want?
I think one of the moments which I found very much inspired by rather than based on, thank you, Dasha, for this subtle distinction, is the moment in the hospital where the disabled soldiers choose to basically commit suicide. We have multiple narratives about desperate desire of the survivors, many of them disabled variously, to move into the aftermath. I think this is one of the moments which feels like a construction, like an ahistorical construction that comes into conflict with history, where one feels that there is a conversation about ethics to be had together with the conversation about aesthetics, right? These are interesting and productive conversations. Now, I also wanted to say something about what Mark said, that we seem to know nothing about histories of our protagonists, to the extent that one suspects that these are people who moved into the city right? One of the dramas of Leningrad at this moment, that there is a huge change of population. Again, the city lost more than 1 million, so many people are moving in. They know nothing about the siege, and they don't want to know anything about the siege. So to some extent, one feels that this is made from this point of view, of the real disaster kind of being covered, being concealed, as you know, Chernobyl by its awful concealing layer, and being muffled by this film. And I think also this is a very unpleasant effect that I had from this movie, that I guess without fully intending to do so, the author of this film gives voice to ignoring these voices, ignoring the stories, not choosing not to work with the stories and history. And actually, I would use the word dangerous to some extent, especially since we're talking about a Russian film.
Mark, you're mute.
I know. Yes. So we remember there was this famous article called "Вредная пьеса." So "Вредный film," right? Sorry about this. Thank you.
There is one more question that I think
one more question.
Address, even though, because I said I think it's a really excellent one from Irina Denishenko. Could Lilya comment on the sound texture of the film? If it would also be possible to address speech to different speech genres, ES speech in particular, that would be great. That was brought up before, but if you could elaborate on this, Lilya, that would be wonderful.
Sorry, what was the second half? Comment on
if possible, also, could you also comment on speech itself, different speech genres, ES speech in particular, etc., sort of within the sound texture of the film?
Yeah. I mean, I found the sound design really super interesting. I think that was my favorite part of the film. Because it's so, and you can see there was almost a dozen people involved in sound design. You know, obviously it was something that they paid an enormous amount of attention to. The fact that it's so unusual, unusual for some genres, obviously, to have total absence of extra diegetic sound, right? The only sound that's coming from within, almost basically no music until the very end. Once the credits roll, the kind of the sort of the trapped inside ES head, I think, is in that, and the guttural sort of weird noises that she makes when she's concussed and when she's having her seizures. I think all of that is incredibly interesting. The fact that she speaks, so they all speak basically through silences, right? There's the unconnected phrases, unfinished sentences, sort of half things said. But the fact that Ia in particular speaks in this really weird way that no one marks. So even at the end, when she keeps repeating "Я напрасная внутри," right? I am useless inside. But is that the best translation of it, right? So she's not "Я пустая," right? I'm not empty. It's напрасная. It's as if like I have no purpose. Right, my insights have no purpose, right? I mean, I think there I would say that we're working with really almost kind of poetic astranение, right? Things, we're literally stumbling over meaning, and we have to stop and think about it, and that's what a lot of the sound is forcing us to do. And when we get the little sort of jazzy tune at the end, even that's broken up. Right, so even that sort of stutters and starts and stops and has this kind of weird, as if the sound is cutting in and out. I had to because I wasn't listening to it in the theater, but on my own computer, I had to make sure that it wasn't my own DVD that was stuttering, right? That this was the actual intent of the design. So I think it's, yeah. So I really, that was, again, if I'm going for the positives, that was definitely one of my favorite things about the film was the strangeness of its sound. what it probably doesn't do, and this is, and I'm looking over at Polina, is again capture the sounds of, right? And this is something that actually Lesnitsa was accused of this, right? That when he did Blockade, and he used all of the documentary footage, but he added little bits of sound to it, right? To footage that was silent. And there's sort of a question of, for document, you know, particularly for claims of documentary filmmaking, right? How much can you add to a document and still preserve its authenticity? So here I almost feel like if we're going to give Balagov any credit for authentic, he's almost doing it in reverse, right? He's taking all the sounds and kind of breaking them up and making them hard to hear. And so I think that's, yeah, to me, that's super interesting.
But that's also German's technique.
Yeah.
If one.
And actually, Trudno być Bogom is one of the is one of kind of the inner texts for this film too, the way that they shoot it and everything.
Thank you. Irina Denishenko comments, her speech sounds like Platonov, meaning ear, of course. We are talking for 2 hours straight, and we intended to do it within an hour and a half with questions. So I think that it's time to wrap it up, unless you want to do some
last words?
crucial statements. Yes.
I want to know if Tony has changed his mind and now he doesn't like the film again, or likes it
Or
even
he
better.
will watch it for the 4th time.
No, actually, I have not changed my mind.
Neither did I.
I'm not quite that flighty.
And I'm pretty sure that Polina didn't change her mind either. So we didn't change our minds, and that was not about changing our minds, but it
May have
was
changed
about.
someone else's mind though.
Did you change your mind,
Me?
Dasha?
Well, I didn't tell you what my mind was in the first.
Yeah, that's exactly my. Do you want to tell your mind?
The first time I saw the film, which I also saw 3 times, once at the Sochi premiere, another time at the New York premiere, the original impression was positive, and then it kind of became, I don't want to say negative, but I kind of soon realized that I overestimated what I thought were the good sides of the film. So yeah, I think that's where I am right now. I'm thinking about millennial cinema right now, so that's where my mind's at. And I kind of like to piggyback on that. I don't think it is making that might be an answer, possible answer to the question about Western influence and making films for the West. I don't think he's making them for the West. I just think he comes from just like a very radically different generation of filmmakers that are only coming into maturity now, and he just had more access to possible influences. So that's a redeeming quality. I feel like that's something to look at.
Yeah.
Do you want to add something to your position, or you said it all?
I think my position remains. I don't want to ever rewatch it, but I'm happy to talk about it.
Excellent. So there are books that, as Nabokov used to joke, that are only good for reading, right? And there are films that are only good for talking about. So this film is definitely good for talking about, but some of us watched it more than once and were not disappointed. And actually, I am among the second category. So I want to thank you all for it was very interesting for me. I hope it was interesting for our dedicated audience that stood for us for 2 hours, and we know how unpleasant it is to look at the Zoom session without any other special effects. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your ideas. I hope that this will start the critical discourse on Dilda, right? And we'll come back in 10 years and revise what we just planted. Thank you, guys.
Maybe then Lilya will watch it again.
All right. Okay. Bye-bye. And thank you, our dear audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Just one last word. Our next session will be about recent Russian TV series. And I cannot find when it will be. I think it will be
November 17th?
It's November 17th, 7 p.m. So mark your calendars, and we hope that we won't disappoint you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.